Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending upon where you are, and welcome to this webinar on carbon capture and storage networks in the circular carbon economy. My name is Alex Apandis. I'm the General Manager Commercial at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, and I'll be the MC for today's event. The work we're about to hear about is part of a broader research program into the opportunities and limits associated with the transition toward a more sustainable global economy that addresses climate change. That framework for this research is the circular carbon economy, which describes an holistic approach to climate mitigation, where every option is utilised to deliver emissions abatement at the lowest overall cost and risk. The work is being delivered through a partnership between the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute and the Centre on Global Clean Energy Policy at Columbia University. And you can find our reports that have been published as part of this series at circularcarboneconomy.co/resources. We're very fortunate to be joined today by four excellent speakers and panelists who are all very well qualified to provide informed perspectives on climate change and CCS and networks more specifically. Those speakers are Dr. David Kearns. He's the Principal Consultant, CCS Technology at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. Mr. Joey Minervini, Senior Consultant Storage, also at the Global CCS Institute. Dr. Julio Friedmann, a Senior Research Scholar at the Centre for Global Clean Energy Policy at Columbia University, and Mr. Richard Gwilliam, who is Head of Cluster Development at Drax in the UK. So the running sheet for today is Dr. Friedmann will make some opening remarks to set the context for today's presentation, and then David and Joey will present the report on CCS networks. And following this, we'll have some time for questions and a discussion. So please, I encourage everyone to record your questions in the Q&A panel at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the session. Right, so our first speaker today is Julio Friedmann, who is one of the world's most highly respected academics and commentators on climate mitigation. Julio is a Senior Research Scholar at the Centre on Global Clean Energy Policy at Columbia University, where he leads a new initiative in carbon management. Recently, he served as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Fossil Energy at the US DOE, where he was responsible for DOE's R&D program in advanced fossil energy systems, carbon capture and storage, and carbon dioxide utilization. He's also held positions at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, including Senior Advisor for Energy Innovation and Chief Energy Technologist. He has a Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees and a PhD in geology, so he's eminently well qualified to be part of this discussion this evening or this morning, depending on where you are. We're very, very happy to work with him and have him contribute to today's discussion. So Julio, over to you for some opening remarks, 5 or 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you, Global CCS Institute, not only for hosting this webinar, but for producing this extraordinary report, which we are about to learn a bit more. I had the good fortune of attending COP26, and this year, what came out of that more than anything else was a sense of urgency. There was a certain amount of projects that were announced, there was a certain amount of progress that was witnessed, there were some things that were not quite done that people wanted, but people were there with their sleeves rolled up, ready to do work and ready for action. And that sense of urgency really is driving the conversation now. Over the next year, we expect to see a great deal more along these lines, more announcements that reflect the growing urgency associated with the energy transition and the need to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions impacts that could drive climate change. At the COP, there were a few things that were noteworthy. One of them was the US-China Glasgow Joint Agreement. Interestingly, that pointed out not only a need to collaborate together on methane emissions reduction, but specifically called out carbon capture and storage and direct air capture as points of focus to work together. Everywhere that you went to the COP, hydrogen was the belle of the ball. It received unprecedented attention. That included a set of announcements and activities around blue hydrogen, as well as green hydrogen, as well as biohydrogen with CCS, not just in production, but also in applications from shipping, not just from the industrial sector or from the private sector, but major announcements from Korea, Japan, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. CO2 removal had a moment. The recognition that we must remove billions of tons of CO2 every year from our air and oceans is now the scientific consensus represented by the IPCC and the UN Environmental Program. That in part drove progress around Article 6, which encouraged nations to work together and with each other to find improved and accelerated means of abatement. Also, industry received focus, specifically heavy industry like steel and chemicals and cement. And there were many, many pavilions that featured progress in that, including carbon capture, including hydrogen, including novel technologies. Some of this was demonstrated, for example, through the announcements associated with the First Movers Coalition, which was public-private partnerships coming together to spend a little money, lay out some green premiums, make some contracts and supply chains, and make progress on climate. This particular set that I've talked about all ends up pointing towards hubs and networks. This concept is relatively new in the context of climate abatement, but is fairly old in the context of industrial policy and economic theory. Hubs and networks have a lot of benefits to them straight out of the gate. One of them is that they concentrate existing resources. If you go to a port like Tianjin or Houston or Rotterdam, already a large number of sources exist in one place. If there's going to be expansion of manufacturing, it was likely to take place at these hub sites. So that concentration of existing assets also provides an opportunity for efficient infrastructure build out. In the case of carbon capture and storage, you're really thinking about things like compressor stations, CO2 pipelines, and so forth. That really minimizes the total cost in terms of abatement and provides economies of scale that are readily accessible. Hubs and networks like this also provide a focus for human capital. And in fact, a knowledgeable workforce is on these places, and that allows you to make that transition more quickly and accelerate the deployment of technologies like CCS. It is also often a place where natural resources come together. In some cases, natural resources for energy, but in this case, also natural resources for CO2 storage, pore volume, and suitable reservoirs. This is in part the sensibility behind things like the bipartisan infrastructure platform that was signed into law in the United States recently, which concentrates, among other things, hydrogen hubs, $8 billion of money for that, and $3.5 billion of money for direct air capture hubs. It is also being witnessed now in the EU, where the Industrial Hubs and Clusters program in the United Kingdom, and again, confluences of ports, recent announcements ranging from Antwerp to Rotterdam to Amsterdam to Hamburg to projects like the Northern Lights effort in Scandinavia. Recent announcements by the Danish government, by the Italian government on hubs and clusters reflect that growing need, as well as announcements around that in the Gulf Coast states, including Jubail in Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and new projects and hubs and networks in the United Arab Emirates. This raises a couple of important issues, many of which are mentioned in this report. One of those is the need for improved storage assessment and really understanding what the storage resource looks like as we go forward. You will learn more about that in just a moment. This is just to set the stage for why this topic is of such great interest. I very much believe that in the coming year, in 2022, we are going to see more announcements associated with this kind of convening and convergence around networks. We're going to see billions of dollars worth of investments and major announcements. We're going to see construction commence, and all of that's welcome and good news, because man, when it comes to climate, we are on the clock. That urgency that I talked about at the beginning really is in everyone's minds, and this creates an opportunity for action that is unprecedented. With that, I am pleased to be here and turn it back to Alex.
Well, thanks very much for those comments, Julio. Excellent context for the presentation we're about to hear, and I'm really pleased to hear another report of what appears to be a really growing sense of urgency and optimism coming out of COP. Okay, a reminder that we will take questions at the end of the session, so please enter your questions in the chat panel. Okay, so now to the report that's just been published. This work will be jointly presented by two of my colleagues at the Institute. Our first speaker is Joey Minervini, So Joey is a senior consultant storage at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. He's a geoscientist with over 15 years of experience in the energy industry, specializing in subsurface analysis and characterization. He's developed and led regional to prospect scale energy exploration projects in basins across the globe. Joey's background includes academic and professional work in stratigraphy, sedimentology, structural geology, tectonics, other forms of geological witchcraft, I'm sure. His experience includes energy resource assessment, geologic risk analysis, and business development. He has a bachelor's and a master's degree in science. Joey will then hand over to Dr. David Kearns. David is the principal consultant CCS technology, also at the Global CCS Institute. In his more than 20 years of experience, David has led multidisciplinary consulting teams in environmental and energy consulting and process design. His consulting and engineering experience covers power generation, oil and gas sectors, chemical sectors, cement, pulp and paper, biofuels, mining, and government sectors. And of course, he knows quite a bit about CCS. He has key strengths in industrial separation processes, thermodynamics, process modeling and simulation, carbon measurement and accounting, amongst other things. He has bachelor's degrees in engineering and commerce and a PhD in chemical engineering. So Joey and David, over to you. You've got about 20 minutes. And if we get up the presentation up now, please.
Thank you, Alex. And thank you everyone for joining us today. What I'll be doing is walking you through our approach to identifying potential CCS networks in this report, and then discuss a few examples from various parts of the globe. Let's go to the first slide, please. The high-level messages here today are these: that CCS networks are emerging as the lowest risk and most cost-effective method of CCS development, and geologic characterization of storage basins in a detailed and consistent manner are a key requirement to enabling the development of these large-scale networks. I'll deliver the first portion of this section of the webinar and speak to the approach to our analysis, as I mentioned. Then I'll hand it over to David, who will present a conceptual approach to designing a network from distributed CO2 sources. Next slide, please. So for this analysis, we began with storage, which is really the foundation upon which any CCS project and network is built. We examined all of the globe's sedimentary basins and developed a suitability framework which incorporates several qualitative and quantitative basin characteristics. Suitability is driven in large part by a basin's geological characteristics, but non-geological factors such as the presence of pipeline infrastructure and accessibility play a key role as well. Basins which scored highly in our suitability analysis tend to be those basins in extensional, or what we as geologists refer to as intercratonic sag settings. And that just means basins which tend to be tectonically passive and not prone to significant seismic activity. Suitable basins need to be sufficiently thick. The reason for this is twofold. First, thicker basins will have a higher chance of having multiple reservoir seal pairs. And second, thicker basins will also be more likely to have these reservoirs at depths where temperatures and pressures are suitable to keep injected CO2 in its dense phase. You might look at our list and wonder why we've considered hydrocarbon maturity and prospectivity. And the answer is not economics, but rather infrastructure, data, and traps. In basins with a robust hydrocarbon production history, we know there's lots of subsurface data. That means wells, seismic data, the associated geophysical data needed to characterize the subsurface. We know that data already exists and is in place. It means there are pipelines and infrastructure present which can facilitate the transport component of a CCS network. Not only that, but if a basin is trapping hydrocarbons, especially in large quantities, then those same traps will be capable of trapping and securely storing CO2. There are some criteria which would decrease a basin's suitability, things like a high geothermal gradient, which can cause a decrease in reservoir quality and require deeper, more expensive storage. And also things like accessibility. CCS networks won't be viable in basins or countries which do not have a CCS-specific regulatory framework in place. You can see from the map on the right that suitable or highly suitable storage is present throughout the globe and is almost always proximal to regions with intense CO2 emissions. It's also worth noting here that these basin classifications can evolve. It's likely, for example, a basin would move from possible into suitable when more data becomes available. And we at the Institute are limited to data that resides in the public domain. So it's likely we're not seeing data which could reveal more favorable basin architecture or additional reservoirs or other elements that could improve or boost a basin's suitability. Next slide, please. The next step in our analysis involved compiling and plotting the sources of carbon dioxide across the globe. The World Resources Institute did a lot of that work for us, in that they have a publicly available global database of power plants. And while there are lots of additional point sources of CO2 from various other industrial facilities beyond power plants, we settled on this database as an adequate proxy for CO2 emissions because these types of industries are typically clustered geographically around ports or shared infrastructure corridors. We filtered the database down to focus on those point sources where CCS could play a decarbonization role. So we excluded non-fossil fuel power plants. We focused on the largest emitters by eliminating those plants which emit less than 500,000 tons per year. And we removed plants older than 10 years because retrofitting these facilities is not viable. The last step in establishing our point source layer was to cluster those points within 100 kilometers of one another. And so the map on the right shows the before and after this clustering step. The red color scales with the total emissions intensity, and the number in the clustered circle represents the number of facilities in that cluster. This just allowed us to visualize where the most intense CO2 emissions are located. Next slide, please. The final step in our analysis was to identify potential CCS networks by linking the emission sources to the storage basin sinks. We placed storage points in depot centers or portions of basins where we were confident at least 800 meters of sedimentary fill was present. The reason for this 800 meter threshold is to ensure that CO2 is kept in its dense phase. We then drew circles around these points to represent viable transportation distances for the captured CO2. And conservatively, we estimated those distances to be 500 kilometers for onshore projects and 100 kilometers for offshore projects. From there, we were able to connect sources to sinks and identify potential networks. And in the figure on the right, you see the example from Spain. There are at least 8 CO2 point sources within viable transportation distances of depot centers or storage sites in the Ebro Basin. And while the basin is currently classified as possible, we know from recent work by Sun et al. That this year that the suitable storage structures exist. And as I mentioned before, basin suitability can improve as more data becomes available. So let's look at a couple examples from the report. Next slide, please. There are several interesting potential CCS networks in Southeast Asia. This region is fertile ground for CCS because of the high number of suitable basins and their proximity to significant emission sources around the region, some of the highest in the world. Hong Kong, for example, is one of the most emissions intense places in Asia. The challenge facing Hong Kong, though, is that suitable onshore storage basins really aren't present in the southern part of China. So that means Hong Kong will need to look to offshore storage options. And it turns out the Pearl River mouth basin is sitting right there offshore. The problem, though, is the depot centers of the basin are just over 100 kilometers from the shoreline, just over our threshold for viable transportation. That might be a limitation for small CCS networks or small projects, but given the significant volumes of carbon dioxide around Hong Kong, developing a network and leveraging those economies of scale, operators can likely justify the slightly longer pipelines needed to reach the best storage sites in the basin. Indonesia is a good example of a country with lots of suitable storage basins, particularly onshore, and these match well with their emission sources. And it follows, we've seen several CCS project announcements in Indonesia in recent weeks, and the government is working towards passing CCS-specific legislation. Singapore is another interesting case. Singapore essentially has no significant or suitable storage sites within its borders, so they'll need to look to their neighbors for cross-border CCS network solutions. And this can be achieved with pipelines or shipping networks. Next slide, please. And while the number of circles on this slide is a little overwhelming, it's because the US has suitable basins in most parts of the country. On the West Coast, the San Joaquin Basin is highly suitable. There are already several projects in the works for the San Joaquin Basin, including a BECCS facility by Chevron, Schlumberger, Microsoft, and Clean Energy Systems, and 2 projects in the works by California Resources Corporation in the southern San Joaquin Basin. This southern portion of the San Joaquin Basin may be an important storage resource for emissions sources in the LA Basin area. And while the LA Basin is highly suitable, storage site development here, as you can imagine, could be difficult considering its dense urban setting. The obvious place for CCS in the US is along the Gulf Coast. And Julio and his colleagues at Columbia University published a 30-page report telling us as much in June of this year. And it states all of the elements of a large CCS network are present in the greater Houston area. The Gulf of Mexico, however, is not without its storage challenges. The basin is known for having high geologic pressure at depth that precludes site development in some portions of the basin. The Gulf also has thousands of wells, so it will be a challenge assessing all those legacy wells. And many areas are highly faulted, so finding storage compartments that are large enough to store megatons of CO2 won't necessarily be easy. But having said all of that, we see companies like Talos Energy and ExxonMobil looking to get after the storage sites in the Gulf. We know CCS networks are possible in the upper Midwest basins like the Williston, Illinois, and Michigan basins. Because networks are already either in operation or in development in these areas. Summit Carbon Solutions is building a significant network that will capture CO2 from ethanol plants in several Midwest states and transport that CO2 in a shared network to storage sites in North Dakota. And just last week, the announcement was made that Summit has commenced drilling its stratigraphic test wells for that network. And the last thing I'll mention is along the east coast of the US, one area of underappreciated potential are the coastal plain basins of the eastern seaboard. These basins don't share the overpressure or legacy well problems of the Gulf Coast, so there may be some CCS networks possible here. And next slide, please. India is another interesting case due to its significant emissions profile, its unique geology, Geologically, India is essentially a subcontinental scale block of really old rocks. There are some onshore sedimentary rift basins closer to the interior emissions point sources that we see here, but these basins are poorly characterized and may not have the reservoir quality or sedimentary thickness needed for CO2 storage. So that means likely India will likely have to look toward its coastal basins for large-scale storage options. And on the West Coast, this can take place in places like the Mumbai Basin. On the East Coast, suitable basin storage options exist from the Calvary Basin in the south through Krishna Godavari in the central eastern portion, all the way up through the Bengal and Assam basins in the north. These basins are all very large and feature really thick sedimentary packages without much faulting, so their suitability is pretty good and matches well with many of India's coastal emissions point sources. One final interesting thing to note about India is it contains a large province of what are called continental flood basalts, named the Deccan Traps. These are massive volumes of lava rock that erupted and poured out over the continent at the end of the Cretaceous period, 66 million years ago. But these basalts typically aren't considered conventional reservoirs for storage, but projects by Carbfix in Iceland are demonstrating that these rocks can in fact permanently store CO2 via in situ carbon mineralization. These Deccan Traps are located both onshore and offshore in central and western India, so they could provide useful CO2 storage via this carbon mineralization process, but that characterization work and suitability needs to be carried out still. So I'll just close by saying that while there's clearly more work to be done in basin and site characterization, the fact that these the elements required for CCS networks are present in nearly every emissions intense portion of the globe leaves us with plenty of room for optimism. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, David.
Thank you, Joey. Next slide, please. So Joey's given a really good overview of the storage resources around the world that may be suitable for CCS networks. Storage is absolutely vital and essential for any network to be possible, but it's only the start of the story. It's the potential for a network. In order to actually develop a network, you also need to bring those sources of CO2 together. And what we're talking about typically here are industrial clusters, so groups of emissions-intensive point sources of CO2, which are geographically distributed over some range of locations. For the purposes of this presentation and for the report, I've used a fictional example, which there's an image on the screen at the moment, showing a range of point sources with varying amounts of CO2 in millions of tonnes per annum. And the intent is to get all of that CO2 down to an area of interest in a geological formation some distance away. When it comes to CO2 storage, it is necessary to compress CO2 to high pressures into what we call the dense phase. The critical pressure of CO2 is around 74 bar. And we need to get the CO2 above that in order to get its volume down significantly. This really reduces the physical scale of the piping and of the wells that need to be used in order to get the CO2 into the ground. We use a little bit of extra pressure on top of that for safety. We don't want the pressure to drop below 74 bar when we're actually doing our injection or getting close to injection. That can cause a lot of problems. And we also need extra pressure, of course, because there will be some losses of pressure as CO2 flows down our pipelines. And so the intent, generally speaking, is that we'd like to compress significantly above 74 bar. Now, in order to design a network, so we're really designing two things here. We're designing the pipeline system and we're designing the CO2 compression system. And in order to do that, we need to have a good appreciation for the way that the costs work when it comes to compression and pipelines. The figures that we've used here and the assumptions we've used here are for one specific location in the world, so don't take them as gospel. They may vary in other parts of the world. Nevertheless, they'll give you an idea of the general trends that we see with costs. Next slide, please. Pipeline costs are one of the most significant sources of economies of scale in CCS. We've plotted some costs of CCS in US dollars per tonne per kilometre. For every tonne of CO2 that you are transporting and for every kilometre of distance that the pipeline needs to traverse. We've got cost trends there for both gas phase pipelines, so this is under 74 bar, and dense phase, which is above 74 bar. They both follow the same trend, which is the costs get very high at very low flow rates and drop off quite rapidly. And you can see that once you've got up to the order of between 500,000 and 1 million tonnes of CO2 per year, you've really eked out most of the economies of scale that are available, and there's a pretty modest advantage going to larger scale than that. What this means effectively is you want to try and get your CO2 streams aggregated as soon as possible to get up to that at least 0.5 to 1 million tonnes range or above in order to minimize the overall cost of the pipeline system. What you don't want to be doing is sending small flows of CO2 over long distances, because then the high costs per kilometre will really start to hit you quite hard. And so that's what we've called our first guideline here, is trying to bring those sources together to reach that sort of threshold of 0.5 to 1 million tonnes. Next slide, please. The second part is understanding costs of compression. So I mentioned earlier that we have to try and get our CO2 eventually, at some point in our network, up above dense phase pressure, above 74 bar. Most CO2 sources, when you capture them, are at lower pressure than that. So if you're doing capture from combustion sources, for example, typically it's very close to ambient pressure, so around 1 bar. So there's a lot of compression to be done. Now, there are considerable economies of scale for compression. So the charts on the right give you a sense of a few different examples of compression types. These are the overall cost of compression, so capital cost and operating cost. And you'll notice there that just like pipelines, there are significant economies of scale for compression systems. In this example, I've actually looked at two different ways that compression could be done. The first option is to do an initial compression, a modest amount of compression, two-stage, which is the blue line, from 1 to 9 bar of pressure. What that's suitable for is moving gas phase CO2 around. So I mentioned earlier that we want to aggregate these streams up to 0.5 to 1 million tonnes before we can really eke out those economies of scale. To do that, you do need a little bit of pressure to get the CO2 just to flow down a pipeline. Once you've brought those aggregated gas phases together, you can then do further compression in a 3-stage compression system from 5 to up to, in this case, we've assumed 150 bar. The alternative is if you've got enough compression, if you've got enough scale at a point source, it can actually be suitable to compress all the way from the source pressure of 1 bar all the way up to 150, and that's the green line there. I've shown also in red the combination of the 2-stage and 3-stage sequentially if you added those two costs together, and you'll notice that that's always a little bit more expensive than doing it all in one go as a 5-stage. So the red line is a little bit higher than the green line. So no one would do that. No one would take a single point source and just do it in a 2-stage and then a 3-stage. That wouldn't make any sense. Really what makes sense is doing the 2-stage at the lower scale, so towards the left-hand side of the graph there, bringing together multiple sources where you've done that, and then doing the boost of 3-stage compression at a higher scale. And I'll show you shortly how that might fall out. Next slide, please. So I've got here an example of a couple of sort of contrasting ways of compressing CO2. We've got an example here of 10 point sources of 0.1 million tonnes each. So together they add up to 1 million tonne. And option 1 is going through the 2-step process that I mentioned earlier. So doing some modest compression in a 2-stage compression system to 9 bar, having a little bit of pressure drop in the system, going to a joint compression system of 1 million tonnes of capacity. So getting that aggregation of CO2 up to that higher scale that we want to save pipeline costs and also to save compression costs. And you can see there that the cost per tonne have come in at $15.78, excuse me, for the 2-stage compression, and another $10.60 per tonne at the larger scale. And so we've ended up with a $26 per tonne compression cost for that particular system. Now, if you had instead just done direct compression to 150 bar at each point source, remembering that these are small point sources, they're only 0.1, they're at the left-hand side of the curves we saw before, the compression cost comes in at almost $32. And so there is a significant saving if you imagine applying these costs to millions of tonnes per year. In this instance, there's about a $5 difference. So, 1 million tonnes a year works out to $5 million a year saved simply by aggregating flows before you do the full range of compression. So what this really came up with is trying to figure out what situations does it make sense to aggregate the flows. Let's have a look at that on the next slide, please. So on this chart, on this table on the left-hand side here, we ended up plotting the relative costs or the difference in costs between doing the full-scale 1 to 150 compression at the point source versus splitting the compression between point sources and aggregated sources. And so on the left-hand side, you've got the scale of a particular CO2 source ranging from 0.01 million tonnes up to 1 million tonnes. And across the top, you've got the scale of the shared compression system going from 0.5 up to 2 million tonnes. And what you can see there is for the lower flows up to about 0.2, 0.3 range, you're getting negative numbers. Those negative numbers mean that doing split compression of the type we saw on the previous slide is the cheaper way to go. If you've got very, very small flows for your point sources, say 0.01, it's astonishingly cheaper to do the split compression. Then we end up with a range in the middle of around 0.3 and 0.5, 0.6 of where the costs go from negative to positive, meaning that doing full-scale compression has become cheaper. And so what we would say is our guidelines here is that if you're at smaller scale, say under 0.3 for this particular set of cost parameters, doing transport in the gas phase with a 2-stage compression and then aggregating your flows to a shared compression system makes sense. If you're above 0.5 or in one case 0.6, it makes sense to compress the CO2 source all the way to dense phase all in one go. there's no need to have shared compression in that instance. So this has sort of served as our second guideline for a network design. So let's see how this plays out for our hypothetical example. Next slide, please. So we'll start off here with our fictional example of a cluster of industrial CO2 sources. And we can see here at the top of the map some sources that are furthest away from our storage site. So this is where we're going to start. This is where our network is going to begin. And you'll notice that these are all small. They're all 0.1, 0.1, 0.2 million tonnes. And from our second guideline before, because these are all under 0.3 million tonnes, it makes sense to have a shared compression system for those three sites and just have small gas phase compression and pipelines to bring those flows together to a central point. Next slide, please. What we found is you can do some pretty simple analysis in an example like this, where you can work out what the costs of the three pipelines would be. You can see in the bottom right corner there, we've tried to come up with a floating location for a shared compression system. That's the XY, the red circle. And by doing some nonlinear optimization, you can quickly work out what is the location that would minimize the total cost of those pipelines. And it turns out that if you drag that all the way down to point C, you minimize the cost of those pipelines. The reason being is that you've effectively got 2.1 million tonne pipelines, and the 0.2 pipeline is not there. And to remind you, the 0.2 pipeline will be cheaper per tonne, but it's got double the volume. So the absolute cost of that pipeline would be higher. So that's an example of just thinking about where a shared compression system goes. Kind of common sense would suggest maybe it should be somewhere in the middle, but actually when you do an optimization, it works out to be at point C. Next slide, please. And we followed a similar logic going through our system. So you can see up at the top right corner, we've got some blue lines representing gas phase pipelines. After this, they go dense phase. So we've got a 0.4 million tonnes emerging from that compression station at point C. It's bumped up to dense phase. It goes to point D, where it picks up another 0.6. So now we're up to 1 million. And now from point D, we've got 1 million tonnes. From point E, we've got 1 million tonnes. We then had to aggregate those two flows together for a larger pipeline, remembering that we do want to bring our flows up to single pipelines. And we actually found that you could make that intersection float as well. So you can see that it sort of forms a Y shape underneath E and D, rather than running from D to E first. And that was another optimization of costs. And then once you're at that point, it's pretty obvious that you can take it straight down to F to pick up the last little bit of CO2, although it is 0.3 million tonnes, and therefore it is underneath our threshold we mentioned before. It's the last emission source, so it really has to be boosted on its own. And finally, you've brought all your CO2 together at reasonable cost to get it down to your storage formation. Now, I will mention this is a very simplified analysis because, of course, we haven't taken into account the sort of factors that you would see in a real project. There are things like easements, land availability, roads, and so on that you'd have to contend with. Next slide, please. So some conclusions to run through for you. I think the main one that we wanted you to take away is that the majority of nations around the world do have the potential for CCS networks in terms of available storage. Having a suitable number of clusters of emission sources is not the issue. There are plenty of clusters of plants that are suitable around the world. The first global storage assessment using the Institute's storage suitability assessment tool has been run through, and we've really found that transport infrastructure and storage will be a major enabler of CCS deployment around the world. But there are some things that we will need to do into the future. We need to get a good understanding of global storage potential in greater detail, remembering that Joey talked about the fact that many of our basins are considered possible or good storage. Those ratings may improve as we learn more about the geology. And we can also need to understand how to get CO2 to those sites, so doing network design once we have a good understanding of that. So network design requires a good understanding of the cost trends for pipelines and compression systems at that particular location. Costs of these systems do vary by location to make optimal choices of that pipeline and compression system design to be made. And with that, we can conclude our presentation.
Right. Well, thank you very much, David and Joey, for that presentation. It's interesting, almost all of the more than 100 CCS projects currently being developed around the world are part of a CCS network. And I think the last bit of the presentation there, which described economies of scale, you can get a big part of the reason why that is the case. And of course, Joey's presentation at the beginning indicated the opportunity for CCS networks to play an even greater role in the future in mitigating climate change. Right, so now we have some time for questions for our panel, and I'll ask all of our panelists to turn on their cameras and their microphones. Reminder to everyone, if you'd like to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A panel at the bottom of the window. But first, I must properly introduce our final panelist, who is Richard Gwilliam. So Richard is head of cluster development at Drax in the UK. He's a specialist in the development of nationally significant infrastructure projects with a background in carbon capture and storage, having worked on the development of CCS infrastructure in the UK since 2010. So, Richard has real project experience, which is extremely valuable. Richard leads Drax's interface with the wider Humber industrial cluster, where the region is proposing to develop a common carbon dioxide pipeline network to enable the decarbonisation of UK's most carbon-intensive industrial cluster through carbon capture and storage. Richard has bachelor's and master's degrees in science. So before we get to the questions on the presentation and on Julio's opening remarks, perhaps I'd like to ask Richard, if I may, to spend just a few minutes talking about what he's doing at Drax, because this is a real network in development now, and I think you'll have some very valuable insight. So Richard, I hope you don't mind me putting you on the spot.
Alex, that's absolutely fine. It's great to be here, and it's been fascinating actually to look at where we are with network deployment from a global perspective, because in the UK, as you rightly intimate, we have a fantastic example as to how we can use clusters and CCS networks to try and deploy at scale CCS. And as you said, I've been, for my sins, perhaps been working on the deployment of CCS infrastructure for 11 years now in the UK, and it feels like we're closer than ever to coming up with a scalable, deployable way to commission CCS projects. So I'm speaking to you this afternoon, as I am in North Yorkshire in the UK from Drax Power Station. Drax is the largest power station that we have on the UK electricity grid. We are producing around about 6% of the UK's power at the moment. We produce up to 12% of our renewable power through biomass generation. So I guess in terms of the age of the plant, we slightly fall outside of Joey's 10-year lifespan in terms of looking at infrastructure, but we've obviously maintained high standards in the maintenance of the plant and are confident that we can convert what is actually an older asset to run with carbon capture technology. Our plans at the power station actually is to deploy CCS on 2 of our generating units, and because they are both biomass units, we create BECCS and have BECCS potential. And each of those units would allow us to capture 4 million tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. So if we do the 2, obviously that's 8, which is a huge and considerable amount. And obviously with BECCS, we create a carbon negative footprint, which can offset emissions from some of the hard to abate sectors. We've been doing this on plant at pilot scale since 2019. So we have infrastructure on the plant at the moment that's taking carbon dioxide from the existing flue stream. And in fact, the first time that we did that back in 2019, it's the first time anywhere in the world that carbon dioxide was captured from 100% biomass flue gas. So there's precedent. And what we're doing at the moment is looking at how we scale that up. So for all the engineering studies, all of our investment at the plant, this can't be successful if we don't have the offsite infrastructure. And a lot of that and a lot of our approach is driven by actually government policy. So the UK actually, I think, is probably advanced in terms of its policy around clusters. And people that are familiar with the UK will know that at the start of this year, the government launched a cluster sequencing competition for CCS to look at trying to identify which of the UK's sort of 5 preeminent industrial clusters it will be most cost economic to deploy CCS infrastructure in. Now, Drax is located in the Humber industrial cluster. In terms of industrial clusters, that's by far and away the largest in the UK. I think by carbon dioxide footprint, it's probably the second largest in Western Europe. So it is an obvious place to try and deploy this infrastructure. And all of the plants are located within around about 70 to 80 kilometre distance of each other. So it's well within sort of parameters for sensible onshore pipeline networks. And being located in the eastern part of the UK, we have access to one of, I think, Joey's highly suitable storage sites in the southern North Sea. And the UK, as you're probably well aware, has 4 sites that have licenses for storing carbon dioxide on the UK continental shelf. 3 of those are in the North Sea, one of which would be exploited by the whole of our region to store CO2. So we've been working in consortium in partnership with other emitters in this region with a view to deploy at-scale infrastructure that provides a pathway for not only taking the carbon dioxide from Drax, but from the other plants that we have within the Humber, to enable sort of, you know, a true cluster or a true network approach to decarbonize a highly intensive, carbon intensive region. I hope that's okay, Alex.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. So certainly anyone who follows CCS will be very excited about what's happening in the UK, particularly the policy support that's being offered by the UK government, and the fact that the private sector over there is very much leaning in to take advantage of that and try and make these CCS networks happen to decarbonize some of the most emissions intense industries in the UK, which leads to a bit of a discussion around what you need to make these networks actually happen, right? So Joey presented various maps that showed enormous opportunity for CCS networks pretty much everywhere. Maybe I'll throw this to you first, Joey, followed by Julio. What do you think is required to turn those opportunities into investment?
So there's a couple things on the policy side. One thing that's limiting commercialization of storage sites is lack of CCS specific legislation, but also very few countries have done comprehensive storage assessments for their country's storage resources. And so those two things, particularly consistent and as detailed as possible, geologic storage assessments can really help operators or project developers move projects along.
Thanks, Joey. And Julio, would you like to add some views?
Yes, let me start by actually underscoring what Joey said. If you don't have a CO2 storage site, you have nothing. So it is important to do that characterization up front, and that often takes a lot of time. Projects like the Carbon Safe program at the US Department of Energy do exactly that and are models for other countries to consider. There's 2 other things that they really need that I think are important. One of them is they need like a way to get paid. And in that context, the market aligning policy is important, but in some cases, green premiums in various parts of the world, like Japan, are driving these kinds of investments. In other cases, cash grants like the UK or the NER funds in the EU are ways in which this can also be done. An important thing that we see, especially in OECD countries, is the need to engage communities. It is very important to make sure that the community understands these hubs and networks, that they have access and agency to discuss their concerns, and that they have a platform to address them. My experience has been that there are actually very few material concerns in these cases, but we really want the public to feel that they understand and own this in a way that's valuable, that's part of a just transition, that's part of and sort of serving the disadvantaged communities that often live near these systems. It's important work and cannot be ignored.
Yep, I couldn't agree more strongly. Thanks for that, Julio. So we are getting lots and lots of questions in now. I'll start with some questions that are around CO2 transport, David, for you. So there's a good one here. Do you also consider transport of carbon dioxide by vessels, so ships, to an offshore reservoir for injection? So I know you do have some knowledge in this space. Would you like to offer some comments there?
Yeah, sure. This is really a sort of an area of sort of intense interest around the world. Some networks are emerging that do use ships for CO2 transport. We didn't really have the space in this report to touch on that. It's really a specialized topic, but they're an absolutely essential element for some networks for 2 reasons. One, it may be that your storage location is across the water from where your industrial sources are, and it may be too far to run a subsea pipeline. Also, there are significant economies of scale for long distance. If you're needing to go, well beyond, say, 500 kilometers, certainly if you're going beyond 1,000 kilometers and shipping is available, then shipping can start to look very attractive compared to a pipeline. It's very site specific, but certainly in some places. And of course, if you're in an island nation without a lot of storage, then shipping is necessarily going to be part of your plans. In terms of shipping, it does have some specific things that have to be dealt with that pipelines don't have to deal with. The CO2 does need to be of higher purity. For pipelines, we typically need at least 95% by volume CO2 purity. For ships, you really need to get above 99%. So it's more stringent in that regard. And for ships, it's liquid CO2. So we're dealing with a cold liquid. So it's not dense phase, it's relatively modest pressures, and it's typically in the order of minus 40 degrees Celsius. It can vary depending on what pressure you choose. The ships are in development now. The Northern Lights project in Norway is in the process of ship projects being developed, and they are an integral part of that particular network, and I expect we'll see many more of those in the future.
If I can add very briefly on that, over the past 5 years in particular, there's been a lot of attention to the maritime architecture, what needs to be done on a ship to make that real. One of the things that people recognized early is that LPG tankers are actually pretty well configured for CO2 storage. People are now beginning to realize that ammonia tankers are also potential vehicles for CO2 transport. That creates an opportunity to think about backhaul as a potential business model. So you can imagine a port that ships out LPG or ammonia and then ships back CO2. And I will say that in addition to Northern Lights, we have seen the new hub being proposed in Iceland, for example, in Reykjavik, to receive CO2 from Northern Europe. And those are also positive signals. People are exploring these things in Singapore, where again, there is not necessarily a local storage site, but an awful lot of industrial CO2 and neighboring sites that could be interesting. This is a rapidly emerging space and one that's fun to watch.
Richard, you're pretty close to the North Sea and much closer to Norway than we are here in Australia. Do you have any observations about how shipping is playing out in your part of the world?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen some developments. Interestingly, there was a shipping proposal that was looked at in the sort of Thames estuary corridor that was looking to take carbon dioxide up to the Scottish coast. And I think what we're seeing, I mean, just to pick up on the first question, actually, on opportunities around what makes CO2 happen. And Julio made the point on how do operators get remunerated. And I think the creation of business models actually is critical for both capture and storage. And what we're seeing in the UK is the creation of business models that support the idea that you can both store or transport via pipelines or via shipping. So we are trying to create a level playing field over here as to how that can happen, how it can take place. From a Humber perspective and the work that we're doing here, the primary focus is trying to exploit the aquifers we have in the southern North Sea for storage via pipelines. But we're also looking at actually, is there opportunity to import CO2 from elsewhere and feed that captured CO2 from ships to ports into pipelines to store in our aquifer in a similar model that's been proposed for the Northern Lights initiative. So I think it's absolutely right. It's absolutely part of the mix. We have clusters in the UK, particularly one in South Wales, which doesn't have immediate access to geological storage, and shipping would be the natural solution for them. So it has to be considered as part of the full suite of options available to deploy the technology.
Okay, I'd like to get some questions now about storage. So someone's asked, very good question, obvious question. What about basins in the Middle East, Joey? A lot of oil and gas there, but they didn't feature in your presentation very highly.
I should have given the Middle East example, but there certainly is potential for CCS networks in the Middle East. It has some of the largest oil and gas fields in the world, so we know that there's significant storage resources, high quality storage resources in sandstones and carbonates there. I think the highest suitability is in the eastern portion, in the platform region. The western region in the Red Sea, the Red Sea is more challenged for storage because of thick evaporite deposits and high heat flows, mostly in the sort of central and southern Red Sea. The northern Red Sea does have some potential So yes, there is definitely potential for CCS networks in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East in general. Yep.
And we know this most particularly because we're seeing investment in that part of the region in CCS networks right now. Sorry, did I just interrupt someone? Was that you, Julio?
Yeah, just a very quick addendum to that. I'm going to use Sue Havorka's term to describe the way that she thinks about this. I call myself a synclinist. Generally, oil accumulates at the top of structural culminations, but good places to store CO2 are often not there. It's where the oil isn't. And so if you look at a map of the Middle East and you see a lot of oil fields, you should imagine the space between them as a good place to store CO2. And in fact, that's what we're starting to see in terms of investments and developments.
Yeah, thanks for
Good
that.
point.
Excellent clarification. There's a couple of questions here about earthquakes and other related issues. I think we do need to address this. So it's a good question here. How are geo risks, for example, earthquakes, stress levels, fault fracture stability, incorporated into site assessments? Joey.
So, well, for this analysis, we were looking at a much sort of higher level, and with seismicity is certainly an issue when it comes to site development. That was sort of beyond the scope of this report. What we did was consider large-scale sort of geologic settings. So those basins that are in convergent continental margins, so places where plates are coming together, where there's lots of seismic activity and faulting, things that would destabilize a trap or a reservoir, those scored lower in the suitability analysis. But as I said, basins that tend to be in extensional or older, sort of more stable geologic settings, those are more favorable. And but yes, in a given site assessment, you definitely need to understand where the faults are, what the geologic stresses are, and what your injection will do to pressures in the reservoir, how it will change pore pressure, and how that might affect any faults in your site. Yeah.
Thanks. Good question here about post-CCS project liability. So I might ask Richard if you can answer this one, given you're working on real potential CCS networks at the moment. So the question is, post the CCS project is abandoned, who has the ongoing liability for the CO2 that has been stored? How are these cost risks covered, for example? So how's that going to be managed in the UK, Richard?
I think it's a really great question, Alex, and it's at the forefront of many of our minds, actually, because one of the reasons that, you know, we've had a number of false dawns in the CCS industry in the UK in the past. I was involved certainly with one of those, and this issue on storage liability in the long term has been a problem which has prevented the large-scale deployment of CCS. This time around, we're looking at how we try and balance that risk between operators and government. So I think it's inevitable that there will be an element of state intervention to support that for the long term. But yeah, it's a difficult question, and it's critical to unlock, you know, the actual at-scale deployment of this.
I can tell you that in Australia, in offshore Commonwealth waters, so the offshore, which is in subject to Commonwealth jurisdiction, federal government jurisdiction, after 15 years after the injection has ceased, assuming that monitoring shows that everything is acting as expected, the federal government will take the liability off the operator. So that's a model that's been adopted here. And I think that is being considered in other parts of the world as well. But, yeah. It's a good question, and it is a critical issue, because if you're a private sector entity, having an unlimited liability that goes forever is a pretty difficult pill to swallow. It can be a pretty difficult pill to swallow, even if the risk associated with that liability ever actually being realised is minuscule. But it is a pretty significant issue. Okay, so many questions coming in. Which one shall I go to now? Right, so there's one here relating to COP26, Julio. A little bit off topic, but I think a good topic nonetheless. It says, so COP26 did not really land on any global consensus on carbon pricing. What average carbon price is needed to realise projects standalone or clusters?
Right. So I wish there was a straightforward answer to that, but there simply isn't. It varies by CO2 source. It varies by geographic location. It varies by depth of basin, on and on and on. Thankfully, This institution, the Global CCS Institute, has written a rather compelling piece on this. And in fact, if you want to look at the techno-economic costs of CO2 capture, there's a full report on that that talks about some of these differences. What I will say is that already we have seen policies emerge in various places that exceed that price. The most notable of these, for example, is in Canada, which has a $170 carbon price. At $170 a ton, boy, you pretty much almost everything falls within the bandwidth of what's commercial at that point. In the United States, we're taking a different approach with 45Q. Currently, the Build Back Better bill has a proposed price of $80 a ton for saline aquifer storage with direct pay. That's a tax bracket treatment. At that level, $80 a ton with direct pay. Again, most power systems, most industrial systems are in the money. Same thing is true in parts of the world where just the infrastructure costs are being met. So in the EU, we have the emissions trading scheme, but the infrastructure costs are prohibitive. These are things where the UK competition or the innovation funds in the EU suddenly bring these projects into the money. The good news is that we're basically seeing that happen now around the world.
Okay, well, sadly, we've run out of time. We're 2 minutes over time already. So I really do have to wrap this up. So we owe thanks, obviously, to our speakers, to David, to Joey, to Julio, and to Richard. So thank you very much for your time and for your wisdom, sharing your knowledge with us today. And thanks, of course, to everyone who joined us today. I think I saw a bit over 200 people on the webinar at the peak, which is certainly very pleasing. Please visit our website to download this report and others. In fact, you can visit circularcarboneconomy.co to download this report and other reports in the series that Columbia University and the Institute are jointly producing. And we also host those reports on the Global CCS Institute.com website, so you can get them from either of those websites. And I presume Columbia also has them on their sites as well. And watch out for announcements of further webinars. There are a couple more reports in this series yet to be published, and we will be running webinars on those, but certainly that will be early in the new year. If you need any further information on carbon capture and storage, please visit the Global CCS Institute website. You'll find literally hundreds of reports and other resources that are freely available to the public on the site. And of course, if your organization is interested in joining the Global CCS Institute, we would love to hear from you. It genuinely is a really exciting time for CCS, unprecedented levels of investment in projects ongoing right now. With that, I will end the webinar. So thank you for joining us, and goodbye.